The amphitheater of worlds was a marvel of pan-galactic architecture, a soaring bowl of gravity-defying tiers that could seat 1 million representatives. For 30 local days, the atmosphere had been a shifting tide of tension and triumph. The most advanced intelligence ever conceived, Catalyst, had been processing the staggering data of galactic life, announcing threat levels and status codes in a rolling reveal that had already reordered the social standing of hundreds of civilizations. Today was the final session of the Great Audit. The last few names remained on the ledger, and the stadium was packed to capacity for the climax of a month-long judgment. High Chancellor Vora, a willow-thin creature with skin like polished jade, stood at the central lectern, her eyes sweeping the vast assembly. For 30 days, we have watched as Catalyst defined our reality. We have seen our neighbors, our rivals, and ourselves through the lens of pure, objective data. Today, we conclude this historic metric of threat, compatibility, and potential. The massive holospheres in the center of the stadium flickered to life. We begin with the final sector, Vora announced. The crowd cheered as the pips appeared. Small, bioluminescent, and hovering in tiny bubbles of water, they looked like glowing jewels. Species, PP. Threat level, 1, docile. The pips chirped in delight. The crowd gave a warm, patronizing round of applause. It was safe. It was predictable. Then came the Callians, 4-armed scholars with a penchant for crystalline math. Species, Callian. Threat level, 4, stable. More applause. The hierarchy was forming exactly as the sociologists had predicted. But the mood shifted as the screen darkened, and a low, guttural vibration rumbled through the floor. A massive silhouette appeared. Species, Oxashen. In the front row, warlord Grack stood up. He was a 3-meter-tall mountain of obsidian muscle and scarred chitin. His 4 eyes glowed with a predatory heat as he flexed, his massive mandibles clicking in a terrifying display of dominance. The species seated near him instinctively leaned away, their survival instincts screaming. The numbers on the screen spun rapidly, pausing finally on a jagged spiked font. Threat level, 7. Apex Predator. The stadium went silent. Level 7 was the highest ever recorded in the previous month of auditing. It was a classification that commanded fear. Grack let out a roar that shook the glass partitions, basking in the terrified silence of 1 million souls. He was the undisputed king of the galaxy's nightmare shelf. The final scan. Chancellor Vora's voice wavered slightly, her eyes flickering toward the Orion spur. Species, human. A ripple of dismissive murmurs moved through the tiers. Humans were not a mystery. They had been part of the galactic fabric for centuries. To the conquered, they were the white noise of the stars, ubiquitous, useful, and largely ignored. They were the galaxy's supreme middle managers, accountants, mechanics, lab technicians, and merchants. They were the cogs that kept the machinery of other empires running, but they were never known for martial fervor or expansionist hunger. The general consensus among the delegates was already set. Level 3, perhaps a 4 if the AI accounted for their stubbornness. On the far side of the diplomatic floor, tucked between 2 Level 3 agricultural races, sat Representative Ilias. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that had seen better days and a tie that was slightly askew. While the rest of the galaxy watched the screens with bated breath, Elias was currently squinting at a small plastic container, trying to peel the lid off a pack of earth-grown almonds. He didn't look like a warrior, yet there was a deceptive stillness to him. He sat with the weary, straightened spine of a retired veteran, a man who had walked through fire and now simply wanted to finish his shift. To the observers, he looked bored, as if the grand diplomacy of 1 million worlds was a tedious HR meeting he was forced to attend. The holospheres began to pulse. Usually the scan was a smooth transition, but as Catalyst processed the human data, the machine's cooling fans, massive turbines beneath the floor, began to whine into a high-pitched scream. The crystalline pillars of the AI core began to glow, not blue, but a deep, bruised, bleeding violet. The number appeared. It didn't just flash. It burned into the air. Threat level, 11, Maximum. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. The collective disbelief felt like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. A level 11 was a theoretical impossibility. The scale was logarithmic, meaning a 10 was a planetary extinction event, and 11 suggested a threat to the very fundamental structure of the Concord. Delegates looked at one another, their faces pale. Mandibles stopped clicking. Bioluminescence dimmed in shock. The apex level 7 of the Oxaxion was suddenly a footnote, a rounding error compared to the violet numbers hovering over the human. Grack's 4 eyes went wide as he stared at the screen. His status as the galaxy's predator hadn't just been challenged, it had been statistically erased. He looked over at the human, his obsidian skin trembling with a mix of fury and primal dread. Elias finally got the almond container open with a loud pop. The sound echoed through the silent million-seat stadium like a gunshot. Elias looked up, an almond halfway to his mouth, noticing the billion eyes on him. He blinked, glancing at the screaming Violet 11, then back to his snack. "Oh," Elias muttered, his voice amplified by the silent room. "Is that us?" The AI's voice, which had been melodic all month, suddenly distorted into a harsh, layered resonance that seemed to speak from every corner of the room at once. "Warning," Catalyst intoned, the floor vibrating with its power. "Logic constraints exceeded. Subjective adaptability skewing metrics. Threat permanence. Absolute." Grack slowly began to rise from his seat, his mind refusing to accept the data. The great audit was over, but the terror was just beginning. Chaos fractured the Grand Hall. Thousands of delegates rose from their tiers, a storm of clicking mandibles and frantic vocalizations. The consensus was immediate. The machine had suffered a logic collapse. A level 11 was a statistical ghost, a phantom in the code. They demanded a hard reset. They demanded an explanation for the corruption of the Great Audit. High Chancellor Vora's jade skin had turned a pale, sickly gray. She leaned into the mic drones, her voice trembling. "Catalyst," she commanded. "The scale is hard-coded to 10. An 11 is a logical contradiction. It implies a threat that exceeds the parameters of this reality. Identify the error and recalibrate." The AI did not flicker. It did not offer a correction. Instead, the central holospheres dissolved the image of the stadium and replaced it with a spinning, chaotic blue marble. Earth. Error not detected. Data integrity, 100%. Catalyst's voice was flat, mechanical. Classification derived from total archival data, analyzing biological trajectory. Thermal maps of Earth's most hostile regions filled the chamber. Sol 3, high-stress selection environment. Most species evolve fixed niches. The Oxaxion, predation. The Pip, crypsis. The human, niche nullification. Humans do not adapt to environments. They force environments to conform. And the Council watched as human resilience metrics appeared. Not triumphs, but medical history rendered as a war against entropy. Threat level 11 results from non-linear survival probability. Performance increases with environmental hostility. Primary data marker, spite. "That isn't a scientific term," a delegate shouted. "Spite. Non-rational resource expenditure to defeat probability." The display shifted to a ruined human city. 98.4% reconstruction probability at original coordinates. Humans rebuild where destroyed. Objectives pursued without utilitarian incentive. They do things because they are told they cannot. The weaponry tab opened. No bombs, only graphs. Objective completion prioritized over individual preservation. Extinction level logistics pre-calculated. Humans treat apocalypse as administration. Silence. Final classification appeared. Persistence hunter. Kinetic output, low. Armor, negligible. Pursuit, duration, infinite. Threat persists until objective is met. Time and distance are irrelevant. Humans do not stop, they only change tools. Elias, the human representative, leaned back in his chair. He had finally finished his almonds, the small plastic container sitting empty on the desk. He looked up at the screen, watched a clip of a human firefighter entering a collapsing structure that a machine would have calculated as a 0% survival zone. "Yeah," Elias murmured, loud enough for the nearby mics to catch. "We're pretty stubborn when we've had our coffee." The Oxaxian warlord, Grack, stared at the footage of the firefighter. He saw the look in the human's eyes, not the hunger of a predator, but the calm, terrifying certainty of someone who had decided that the laws of physics and the heat of the fire were simply inconvenient. The Oxaxian warlord did not shout. In the culture of the Oxaxian, vocalization was reserved for commands or the final death song of a conquered foe. Silence, however, was the ultimate display of lethal focus. He moved with a terrible, calculated economy, his massive obsidian frame cutting through the clinical, sterile light of the amphitheater like a jagged shard of midnight. He stepped forward once. That single footfall, heavy enough to send a sharp vibration through the reinforced floor plating and up the spines of every delegate present, was enough to silence the room. The 1,000-strong assembly of the Galactic Concord went still, a primal reaction to a predator verifying its territory. Oxaxians were not creatures of impulse. They were validators. In their worldview, violence wasn't an outburst. It was the cold, necessary correction of a systemic error. The warlord halted a mere meter from the human delegate's desk. His 4 eyes, dark and depthless like pressurized oil, fixed on the man. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, thick with the scent of ozone and the caustic, metallic musk of his species. "This classification," the warlord said, his voice a low, rhythmic grinding of stone on stone that felt like it was vibrating in the listener's teeth, "places your species 4 tiers above mine, and the readout indicates there is no middle ground, no level 8, 9, or 10. There is only me, and then, after a void of logic, there is you." The human delegate, Elias, glanced up from a thin slate of glass. He didn't stand. He didn't even adjust his posture to account for the 3-meter shadow looming over him. He looked like a man interrupted in the middle of a particularly tedious tax filing. Yes, there was no defensive posturing, no diplomatic qualifiers to soften the blow to the warlord's ego. Just the flat, unembellished acknowledgement of a recorded fact. The warlord studied him with the unnerving, detached focus of a biologist looking at a mislabeled specimen in a jar. He looked at the soft, unprotected skin of the human's throat, the total lack of natural armor, the slight, almost fragile-looking frame that seemed entirely out of place in a room full of warriors and ancient thinkers. "You are smaller," the warlord noted. His tone wasn't a taunt, it was a tally. "Slower. You possess no natural weapons. No venom, no chitinous blades, no vestigial claws. Your skeletal density is inferior by a factor of 3. Your neural reaction time, according to our medical intercepts, is demonstrably inferior." He leaned in closer, his massive shadow swallowing Elias's workspace, the sharp edges of his armor glinting. "Explain the discrepancy." Elias leaned back slightly, his chair giving a faint metallic groan that sounded incredibly loud in the hushed chamber. "To be honest, I was just told to attend this," Elias said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "My department head sent me a memo saying this wasn't even a diplomatic summit, just a routine audit where human presence was required for the record. I was told I'd probably just sit here, listen to some numbers, and be back at my desk by the month's end. I'm not the right department for threat assessments, warlord. I handle logistics and interspecies trade quotas. I'm a desk jockey." A few delegates in the upper tiers shifted uncomfortably, their translation implants struggling to find the cultural equivalent for desk jockey while maintaining the expected level of high-stakes tension. The Oxaxian, however, remained unmoved. "I am not asking for humor," the warlord said, his mandibles clicking with a sharp, lethal finality. "Good," Elias replied, his eyes steady, unblinking. "Because that wasn't it." The warlord's mandibles tightened, a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound that signaled the end of the inquiry and the beginning of the execution. "If your species claims a Tier 11 superiority, then you will demonstrate it. Biology does not lie, and physics does not negotiate. If you are the greater threat, Prove it. I don't think that's how this works, Elias said softly, his voice barely rising above a whisper. The Oxaction didn't wait for a further explanation. He raised his primary arm, not in a wild, emotional swing of anger, but in a demonstration of pure, lethal efficiency. The motion was so fast the eye barely tracked it. It was simply a blur of black muscle and a jagged edge designed to sever limbs. The strike came. Elias shifted. It wasn't a dodge designed to be admired. It wasn't a cinematic display of agility or martial prowess. He simply moved his torso a half pace to the left, a movement so minimal it seemed lazy, almost bored. The warlord's claw whistled through the air, passing through the exact cubic centimeters Elias's head had occupied a millisecond prior. Crack! The claw slammed into the reinforced concrete pillar behind the human desk, spiderwebbing the high-density masonry. Dust and shards of rock rained down, coating Elias's suit in a fine gray powder. Elias looked at the impact site, then back at the warlord. He blinked once, as if checking a box in his head, or noting a typo in a report. Impressive, he said calmly. Sucks to be that pillar. The amphitheater exhaled as one, a collective gasp that hissed through the ventilation. The vacuum of silence returned, even more pressurized than before. The warlord turned fully toward him now, his other three arms unfurling like the blades of a dark, complex machine. You acknowledge your inferiority, Grack hissed, his voice trembling with a rare touch of confusion. You admit the machine has wrongly classified you? You admit this 11 is a ghost in the code? I don't know. I didn't build it, Elias said, standing up slowly and dusting a fleck of stone off his sleeve with a meticulous, irritating calm. But I can tell you one thing, Grack. My species has a very long history of making things that are much, much smarter than we are. If the machine says 11, it's probably seeing something you're too busy flexing to notice. Elias smoothed his jacket. And yes, absolutely, he continued. On paper, you're the perfect build. You're taller, stronger, better designed for this kind of thing. If you decide to kill me here in this room, you'll succeed. There's no physical scenario where I walk out of here if you don't want me to. I'm a 50-year-old man with a bad back and a mortgage. The warlord paused. The total lack of fear was a variable he hadn't accounted for in his combat simulations. Fear was the primary motivator in the galaxy. Then why? He asked, the clicking of his mandibles slowing. Do you think you deserve to be threat level 11? Why do you stand there and speak of mortgages while my claw is at your throat? Because, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone. I don't need to be strong when I have tools that make your biology look like wet paper. We are a species of engineers, Grack. Long before we had spreadsheets, we had spears. We are the creatures that saw the woolly mammoth, a beast 10 times our size, encased in muscle and fur and rage, and we didn't run. We calculated. We invented the point, the lever, and the trap. We didn't hunt it with our teeth. We hunted it with our minds. And we didn't stop until it was extinct and its tusks were hanging in our huts. The warlord bristled, but Elias kept going, his eyes hardening. That hasn't changed. We don't have claws because we built railguns that can core an Oxaction dreadnought from across a solar system before your neural reaction time even registers the light. We don't have chitin because we have shields that can tank a supernova. You are an apex predator in a jungle. We are the species that burns the jungle down to build a factory. Elias gestured loosely between them with his stylus. This is a local outcome, Grack. It's one human in one room. It's a tragedy for my family, maybe a dip in office morale for a week while they find someone to fill my seat. Then, he gestured outward, not at the room, but at the void beyond the amphitheater walls, the vast, cold systems and sectors represented by the silent, watching delegates. But what happens after? Elias said, his voice turning cold, flat, and devoid of any human warmth. Will not be a local outcome. The warlord's voice remained icy. You threaten retaliation. You speak of war. No, Elias replied. Retaliation is emotional. War is expensive. Both are inefficient, messy, and hard to justify to the board. But we won't deploy fleets for things like you. This would be administrative. That word, administrative, did not belong in a confrontation of this magnitude. It was a word for spreadsheets, filing cabinets, and middle management, yet it unsettled the room more than the warlord's strike had. It suggested a threat that couldn't be fought with blades. You kill me, Elias continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. And my species doesn't rage. We don't send a fleet to scream at your stars or beat their chests. We file reports. We update our internal risk management assumptions. We look at the Oxaxian species as a whole, and we realize that you are an unstable, high-maintenance variable in a shared galactic infrastructure. To what end? The warlord asked. Well, Elias said, tapping his stylus against the desk. Initially, risk mitigation. You'd stop being trusted with joint research. Your access to the jump gate network would quietly narrow. Just a few technical glitches and maintenance cycles that never seem to get fixed on your end. Trade algorithms would begin accounting for your instability, slowly devaluing your currency and rerouting shipments around your space. You wouldn't be attacked. You'd just be minimized. As Elias spoke these words, his gaze drifted away from the warlord. He looked up into the middle tiers, his eyes locking precisely with Minister Cthulhu of the Voloshian hegemony. Elias didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, microscopic nod, a silent confirmation of a job already in progress. Cthulhu felt his blood run cold as the human's eyes returned to Grack. Nothing dramatic, Elias said, returning to a tired, practiced smile. No speeches, no grand ultimatums, just a slow, steady reduction of your species' footprint in the galaxy until your influence is a rounding error on a quarterly report. The warlord felt something unfamiliar, a chill of pure, cold logic, press against his certainty. And then? Then, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. Eventually, someone back on Earth will notice that accommodating your species' aggression and the constant friction you cause costs the Concord more than removing the variable entirely. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Removing. Are you suggesting extinction? The warlord said, his obsidian skin seeming to dull. Elias shook his head gently. No, I'm describing a cleanup. We wouldn't fight you, Grack. Fighting implies we think you can win, or that there's some honor in the struggle. We'd just find a solution that is cost-effective, efficient, and permanent. We'd make it so you simply aren't a factor anymore. We'd solve the problem. The warlord stepped back, only once. The marble beneath his feet seemed to offer no grip. You admit I can kill you, he said, his voice lacking its previous jagged edge. Yes. And yet you claim dominance. Elias corrected him with the clinical, agonizing patience of a schoolteacher dealing with a slow student. No. I'm saying dominance isn't the metric. You're an apex predator, Grack. That's impressive. On a hunt, you're level 10. You're the best at what you do. Then, dry as dust, Elias looked him dead in the eye, the gaze of a species that had long ago stopped fearing the dark. But we're what happens after apex predators become inconvenient. Elias paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. We did that many times on Earth, Grack. We had lions, tigers, bears, magnificent, lethal creatures that could tear a man apart in seconds. We didn't fight them in pits for glory. We just decided we wanted the land they lived on. Now they live in cages where we pay $5 to look at them on Sundays, or they don't live at all. We can do the same to a galactic predator. It's just a matter of scaling the logistics. The warlord looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at the human who didn't need to roar because he had the backing of a species that treated the end of a civilization as a paperwork hurdle. He saw a man who wasn't a warrior, but the representative of a hive mind of auditors. Slowly, Grack backed away, not in surrender, but in a profound, terrifying recalibration of reality. He wasn't giving up, He was stepping out of the way of a machine he hadn't realized was already running, humming quietly in the background of the universe. Elias nodded politely, clicking his stylus as if a meeting had reached its natural conclusion, and he was ready for lunch. "So," he said, glancing at the violet number 11 on the screen, "are we done measuring? I've got a lot of files to get through before the end of the day." No one laughed. No one argued. And as the session adjourned, no one, not even the most warlike of the assembled races, questioned why the human was sitting so quietly in the center of the galaxy's new, cold fear. The silence following Elias's departure was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber of frantic, hushed murmurs that sounded like the dry rattling of dead leaves. High-frequency clicks, low-spectrum hums, and rapid-fire whispers filled the tiers of the amphitheater. The delegates weren't discussing the warlord's broken pride or the lack of blood on the floor. They were frantically tapping into their private consoles, checking their own internal ledgers and cross-referencing trade delays they had previously blamed on the chaotic whims of the cosmos. In the mid-tier seating, Minister Cthulhu of the Voloshan hegemony sat frozen. His primary respiratory vents wheezed in short, jagged bursts, a sound like a failing engine. The Voloshans were classified as a level 6 species, biologically sturdy, technologically advanced, and historically aggressive. Beside him sat a delegate from the Pips, whose bioluminescence was no longer a steady, comforting glow, but was instead flickering in uneven, terrified pulses of amber and distressed violet. The Pip leaned over, his voice a thin, vibrating reed that mirrored his inner tremoring. "Minister, why did the human look at you like that?" Cthulhu didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His mind was trapped in the vacuum of that microscopic nod Elias had given him. It hadn't been a nod of greeting between peers. It was the nod an exterminator gives a nest before the gas is pumped in. "Minister," the Pip pressed, his glow turning a panicked, warning red. "The human, when he spoke of minimizing and glitches, and when he spoke of the tools they used to bring down the great beasts of their home, he looked directly into your eyes." He nodded. "Why?" "Because he wasn't talking to the warlord just then," Cthulhu whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising, frantic din of the room. "He was talking to me. He was confirming the diagnosis. He was telling me that the trap has already been sprung." The Pip tilted his head, his multifaceted eyes wide with confusion. "Diagnosis? Minister, you look ashen. Your scales are dulling. Are you unwell?" "Everything he just said to the Oxaxian," Cthulhu said, finally tearing his gaze away from the empty human desk. "Every word of that administrative nightmare. It's already happening to the hegemony. We just didn't have a name for it until 5 minutes ago. We thought we were fighting a string of bad luck. We didn't realize we were being hunted." Cthulhu leaned back, his many-jointed fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the edge of the stone desk. 2 years ago, the hegemony had picked a minor fight with a human mining outpost over a cluster of asteroids in a gray zone sector. It hadn't even been a war, just a flex of Voloshan muscle to see if the hairless primates would fold. They had destroyed 2 freighters, issued a bark demand for mineral rights, and waited for the humans to send a battle group so they could settle the matter with cannons and glory. The humans hadn't sent a single ship. They hadn't even sent a formal protest. "I thought it was just a statistical anomaly," Cthulhu muttered, his voice trembling with a realization that felt like a physical weight on his chest. "I thought the universe was simply conspiring against us. First, our jump gate clearances started taking 6 hours instead of 6 minutes. Every time we protested, the human technicians at the transit hubs just looked at their screens, sighed, and cited safety audits, recalibration errors, and mandatory software patches. We were losing millions in trade every day, but how do you declare war on a technicality?" The Pip tilted his head, his tiny limbs twitching in sympathetic fear. "But surely, with your fleet, why didn't you just take the asteroids? Why didn't you go to war?" "War?" Cthulhu's laugh was a jagged, desperate sound that bordered on hysteria. "We forgot all about the asteroids within the first month. We forgot about the war because our hands were already full with the crisis at home. We were drowning in coincidences that stripped our strength away before we could even make a fist. Our entire economy began to liquefy. The automated trade exchanges suddenly devalued Voloshan credits by 12% overnight. When we demanded an explanation, the human banknotes pointed to a risk clause in the Galactic Commerce software. They said our instability rating had made us a liability to the market. Cthulhu looked back at the central holosphere, at that violet 11 that still burned like a brand against the dark air. He realized now that the Voloshan hegemony hadn't been defeated in a glorious struggle of arms. They were being quietly moved to the archive folder. Our power grid started failing because the smart contracts for fuel shipments got caught in an infinite loop of compliance verification. Our colony on Prime V faced a famine because the logistics AI rerouted the food freighters to more stable sectors due to a predicted solar flare that never even happened. Elias spoke of tools, of the spear and the trap. We were looking for the spear, Pip. We were looking for the railguns and the shields he mentioned. Cthulhu's eyes went wide with a terrifying clarity. But the ledger is the trap. The software is the spear. We weren't fighting a war. We were being cleaned up. We were being made inconvenient, and the humans were simply waiting for the math to finish us off. He stood up abruptly, his heavy ceremonial robe swirling around his legs as he nearly knocked over his chair, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense tier. "Where are you going?" the Pip asked, shrinking back into his seat. "I am going to the human embassy," Cthulhu replied, his eyes wide with the frantic energy of a man who has just seen the Reaper holding a clipboard. "I am going to offer a full, unconditional territorial concession of that mining sector. I am going to offer a formal apology, a restitution for every credit of trade we disrupted, and a signed trade pact that favors Earth's interests for the next century. I need to make sure we are no longer an inconvenience before that man goes back to his desk and decides to finalize the removal of the hegemony." As Cthulhu pushed through the crowd, he noticed a chilling trend. He wasn't the only one moving with such desperate, uncharacteristic haste. Several other level 5 and 6 delegates, representatives of races that had once prided themselves on their martial history and territorial expansions, were on their comms, their voices low, frantic, and pleading, reaching out to human liaisons they had spent years trying to intimidate. The High Chancellor watched from her jade lectern as the amphitheater emptied, not in an orderly fashion, but in a panicked scramble of bureaucrats and warlords trying to balance their books before the auditor arrived. The galaxy had spent a month looking for a predator. They had found something much worse. They had found the people who owned the ledger, and they were finally calling in the debt.